briefing hall aboard orbital station Kestrel buzzed with excitement as the students of the Galactic Survival Academy gathered for their next challenge. The air shimmered slightly from the presence of so many different species. Cold-blooded reptilians, towering insectoids with translucent wings, bioluminescent water breathers wrapped in shimmering robes, and at the edge of the crowd, one human. His name was Lance Avery. Lance stood quietly with his arms crossed, his eyes watching the large holographic display suspended in the center of the amphitheater. He didn't fidget or shift his weight like some of the others. He didn't exchange confident banter or speculative theories. He simply listened. It was always better to observe before acting. The hologram showed a planet, Virex 9, rotating slowly with a dull gray atmosphere swirling in violent spirals. Red-orange lightning flickered across its equator, and acid rain patterns danced in real-time overlays, painting the terrain with glowing veins of danger. This was not a place designed to welcome life. The professor, an ancient Zalari known as Instructor Vishar, rose to the podium. Her 7 eyes blinked in unison, her voice a symphony of layered tones as she addressed the class. You are all aware of the parameters. Virex 9 is a level 5 hostile environment world. You will be dropped into the planetary surface with no survival gear, no shelter modules, and no atmospheric armor. The objective is simple. Endure for 12 standard hours. Survive, and you pass. Fall, and you return to re-education. Several students laughed, especially the Crathy twins, who boasted exoskeletons harder than steel. The 3-headed Zorn beside Lance clicked his tongues in amusement, only Lance remained still. Instructor Vishar continued. The test begins at 0 hour, local dusk. That is when Virex 9's atmosphere reaches peak acidity and thermocorrosive precipitation begins. All of you will be dropped within a 20-kilometer radius of the extraction point. Use your knowledge, your biology, or your intelligence, whatever you rely on. Make sure it's enough. Lance didn't need to hear the rest. He already understood what this was, a test designed to favor those with innate advantages, acid-resistant skin, chemical filtration lungs, natural hibernation states. But none of those applied to him. He was human, fragile by most galactic standards, lacking redundant organs or dermal shielding. But what humans lacked in biology, they made up for in something else. Adaptation. He had no claws, no armor plates, no secret glands. What he had was creativity and an unshakable instinct for survival, rooted in millions of years of struggle on Earth, a planet known to the galaxy as one of the rare death worlds. To survive on Earth was to live on a razor's edge. Lance had grown up hiking freezing mountains and scorching deserts. Virex 9 was just another challenge. And he was ready. Hours later, the dropships hovered over the gray, turbulent skies of Virex 9. The wind screamed against the hull as the students suited up in their basic station uniforms. No armor, no tech. The point was to survive with nothing. Lance secured his boots, double-knotted his laces, and tapped his wrist once to log his vitals. The alien students around him flexed their joints, hissed or chittered in anticipation. The Crathy twins argued about who would find shelter first. A gelatinous being named Urmel boasted that she could absorb the rain without flinching. One feathered Valerian claimed he could meditate through the entire storm. Lance didn't say anything. As the dropship doors opened, the full fury of Virex 9 came into view. The sky above was thick with dark green clouds streaked with lightning. Below, a jagged landscape of rocky ridges, corroded metallic ruins, and bone-white trees twisted under gale-force winds. It smelled like burning copper and wet ash. It looked like the inside of a rusted furnace. The drop sequence began. Students leapt from the bay one by one, their bodies shimmering in the acidic light as they descended. Lance waited until his turn, then jumped. The moment he hit the ground, he dropped into a crouch, one hand steadying his weight against the gravel. His boots sizzled slightly, nothing critical yet, but he could feel the tension in the air. The storm wasn't here yet, but it was close. He moved quickly, ducking behind a fractured pipe structure and scanning the horizon. The ruins of an old mining station spread out in the distance. Scrap metal, crushed vehicles, melted tool racks. Useless to some, treasure to him. Lance didn't waste time trying to find a cave or burrow into the rock like some of the others might. Instead, he headed toward the biggest concentration of junk. His instincts told him that raw materials would be more valuable than any natural cover. If he couldn't find protection, he would make it. As he climbed over the twisted remains of a shuttle hull, he found what he was looking for. Bent sheets of duraluminum, broken antenna struts, melted cables, fabric tarps half disintegrated but still whole in places. He smiled. The wind picked up. A crack of thunder split the air. The acidic storm would begin within the hour. He needed to work fast. Lance set to gathering everything he could carry. He wrapped the tarp over one shoulder, tucked rods beneath his arm, coiled wires around his waist. A broken crate gave him a handful of screws and bolts. His hands worked without hesitation, flipping, turning, testing the tension of each component. He didn't have tools, but he had fingers, pressure, friction, leverage. As he crouched inside a half-collapsed transport bay, he assembled a rough structure. A central rod with crossbeams made from lightweight tubing, their ends curved to create tension. The canopy would be crude, but if angled correctly, it would redirect the rain. The fabric needed reinforcement. He threaded the thickest wire through its edge, bending it into shape with the weight of a rock and pressure from his boot. The sky roared again. The first drop of acid fell nearby, hissing against metal. Time was running out. Lance double-checked the seams. No leaks, no frayed points. He didn't care if it was ugly, he only cared if it worked. He flipped the makeshift umbrella upright and extended it slowly. The frame creaked, groaned, but held. Then came the downpour. The acid rain hammered the landscape like molten glass. Alien students scattered across the valley screamed, stumbled, collapsed behind cover that melted in seconds. The air filled with the stench of chemical decay and scorched organics. Biologies that were once considered superior began to fail. Skin bubbled, armor cracked, nervous systems overloaded. But Lance stood beneath his umbrella, eyes narrowed, shoulders steady. The canopy hissed and steamed above him, but the acid rolled down its sides, unable to breach his improvised shield. He turned and began walking, not running, not hiding, just walking. The test had begun, and Lance Avery had already taken the first step toward winning it. Lance didn't look back as he moved through the metallic wasteland of Virex 9. The acid rain struck the ground with such ferocity that it carved shallow grooves into stone within minutes. Steam rolled across the cracked terrain, mixing with clouds of green gas rising from dissolving mineral veins. His boots left brief impressions in the bubbling soil before the rain hissed them away. The air burned with a sharp metallic taste, but the makeshift umbrella held firm above him, shielding him from the downpour. The wind howled louder now, picking up sheets of corrosive mist that whipped sideways across the plain. Lance adjusted his grip on the umbrella's central rod, tilting the canopy into the wind with practiced precision. He felt the strain in his wrist as the wind tried to twist the fragile frame out of alignment, but he pressed forward, angling his steps across the slope rather than against it. His every movement was calculated, controlled, not out of fear but necessity. To his left, in the distance, he saw a burst of yellow sparks. An alien cadet, a Centauran with reflective armor plates, was trying to deploy an emergency beacon that short-circuited in the acidic drizzle. The Centauran screamed as a panel on her back exploded, sending smoke curling into the air. She stumbled and dropped to one knee, her armor steaming where the rain found a crack near her shoulder. Lance didn't change direction. He couldn't help her without risking his own equipment, and besides, the instructors had warned them, this was not a cooperative test. Survival was individual. He reached the remains of what once might have been a mobile drilling platform. Its frame was half consumed by previous storms. The outer hull collapsed in on itself like a crushed soda can. But inside, within the shadows, there was shelter from the wind and the open sky. Not safe, but temporarily less exposed. Lance ducked inside and leaned the umbrella against a wall, allowing the runoff to splash against the metal floor where it pooled with other acidic droplets, eating shallow holes into the plating. He took a breath and listened. The screams outside had stopped. Now there were only the sounds of metal groaning and rain sizzling as it touched anything unprotected. Somewhere far off, a structure collapsed with a hollow boom, muffled by the storm. He crouched beside a pile of discarded wiring and pried open a ruined control panel with his bare hands. His fingertips were red from earlier scrapes, but he didn't feel the sting anymore. His focus drowned it out. Inside the panel, he found more copper wire, insulation, foam hardened by time, and a few cracked power cells. Nothing immediately useful, but he took the wire and tucked it into the side pocket of his pants. Everything could become something later. Always collect. He moved deeper into the platform's interior, ducking under beams and stepping over corroded machinery. The storm wasn't letting up. If anything, it was intensifying. His umbrella would hold for a while longer, but he'd need to reinforce it eventually. The joints would start to give way under pressure, or the material would tear. There was no such thing as perfect protection in a place like this, only temporary victory over the environment. His thoughts were interrupted by a sharp sound, a quick, desperate gasp. He froze and turned slowly, scanning the shadows behind a crumpled engine. There, huddled beneath a tangle of melted scaffolding, was an alien cadet. A Marnix female, pale green with segmented limbs and dark eyes. Her lower carapace melted through in spots, leaving patches of raw muscle exposed to the air. She was shaking uncontrollably, her secondary arms curled around her midsection as she tried to shield herself from the droplets leaking through the broken ceiling above. Lance approached cautiously, his steps slow and measured. She looked up, her eyes wide and unfocused. "Don't come close," she hissed through clenched teeth. "I failed. You'll fail too if you stop." He crouched beside her but kept a small distance. "How long have you been here?" he asked. His voice was even, unemotional. He had no intention of offering sympathy, just information. She coughed, and blood spattered the metal beneath her. 15 minutes, maybe 20. My suit ruptured. I didn't know the rain would be this strong." Her eyes searched his face, then flicked to the umbrella behind him. "You built that?" Lance nodded. "Scrap and resin. Works better than hiding." She looked back up at the ceiling. "It's all corroding. I thought this place would last, but everything here dies." He stood. "Then don't stay. Move." "I can't, my legs." He didn't argue. He turned and walked back toward the umbrella. The platform shuddered again, and he knew it wouldn't last through the next impact. The rain was eating through the supports. A few more minutes and it might come down entirely. He reached the entrance, flipped the umbrella open, and stepped back into the storm. The acid hissed above his head, but the canopy deflected it. He took 2 steps forward, then paused. He turned back toward the ruined interior. "You have a minute," he called into the wind. "If you can crawl, follow me." There was no response. He walked. The rain came in heavier now, soaking the ground and turning it into sludge. The mineral pools glowed an angry orange, and several skeletal trees collapsed under the weight of the falling liquid. Lance passed through a narrow canyon where the walls had been carved smooth by decades of storms. On the far side, he spotted another cadet, an avish male with 6 legs and translucent skin, crouched beneath a crumbling overhang. His arms wrapped tightly around his thorax. Lance didn't stop. That one wasn't even conscious anymore. Everywhere he went, he saw remnants of effort. Shelters hastily built and already melted into slag. Holes dug and filled with acid water. Organic shields grown from regenerative cells, now split and bubbling. The aliens had relied on what made them unique. Lance relied on what made him human. His mind. He reached a high ridge where the land leveled out. From here, he could see across the wide valley where many of the cadets had landed. What he saw confirmed what he suspected. Most of them weren't moving. The test wasn't about pain tolerance. It wasn't about muscle or instinct. It was about adaptation. He found another ruin nearby, a collapsed satellite relay dish whose curved structure had collected acid into a shallow pool. Lance crouched near it, watching the flow. He noticed how the dish's angle caused the rain to drip toward one side. He began to dig a channel using a shard of metal, redirecting the runoff into a deeper depression in the ground, where it could safely dissolve. By shaping the environment, he made a tiny safe zone, a dry island in a storm of death. He stood inside this zone for a while, umbrella steady, eyes sharp. He didn't rest. He didn't let his muscles relax. The rain wouldn't stop just because he needed a break. The storm respected no weakness. At the edge of his vision, something moved. He turned. From the direction of the drilling platform, crawling slowly across the ground, came the Marnix cadet. Her body dragged across the gravel, one arm clutching her side, her legs trailing uselessly. Her eyes locked on him, and despite the agony in her expression, she pulled herself forward, inch by inch, through acid-streaked dirt and bone fragments. She didn't speak. She didn't ask for help. but she crawled. Lance didn't move toward her. He simply watched. If she made it close enough, he'd adjust the umbrella, but she had to reach him first. She got within 5 feet before her strength failed. Her hand trembled as it reached toward the edge of the dry zone. Lance stepped sideways and tilted the umbrella so the outer edge extended toward her. The acid bounced off and curved around her, missing her exposed skin by inches. She lay there, panting, steam rising from her scorched back. Neither of them spoke. The storm continued. The rain kept falling, thickening in weight and acidity, as if the planet itself had grown angrier. The storm's rhythm no longer felt random. It pulsed in waves, each surge harder than the last, each gust sharper, more merciless. The hiss of acid against metal and rock had become an ambient chorus of destruction, rising and falling like a twisted melody. Lance remained focused, his mind detached from the chaos. He had no intention of waiting for the storm to pass. Instead, he intended to shape his environment to function within it. The Marnix's cadet Liry, she had finally whispered, was now conscious but visibly weaker. Her upper limbs trembled from exertion, and her jaw locked each time pain surged through her spine. Still, she had crawled her way into the protective arc of the umbrella's shadow. That alone told Lance everything he needed to know about her will to survive. He didn't need to speak it. Words had no use here. She remained silent as he worked, her eyes tracking him with a mixture of curiosity and disbelief. Lance had returned to scavenging. The structural bones of the nearby collapsed dish offered him new ideas. He examined the bent steel and realized the curvature had potential. With some force and improvisation, he could reinforce the umbrella, turning it from a mere shield into a storm-hardened exoskeleton. That, in turn, would allow him to move freely, possibly even carry someone if he had to. He knelt and began to disassemble the dish with a shard of tungsten he had pocketed earlier. Each bolt he removed required leverage and timing, as the acidic mist in the air had already begun softening the exposed edges. His fingers bled from contact with the jagged surface, but his face remained calm, focused. Pain, as always, was an irrelevant signal. The first section he pried free was long and slightly concave, ideal for channeling acid runoff. He tested its flexibility by placing it across a pair of stones and applying his weight. It bent, but didn't snap. That would become the umbrella's new central spine. He dragged it back to the dry zone, careful not to let any runoff from the surrounding terrain trickle down the groove and into his camp. Liry spoke only once. "You're not like the others." He didn't look at her. "No, that umbrella, you made it from nothing." He still didn't look. Nothing is still something, if you know how to look. She closed her eyes and remained quiet after that. Lance restructured the frame by removing the weakest rods and inserting the dish's curvature as a supportive crossbeam. To fuse the parts, he used a trick he had learned during a monsoon survival course on Earth, tight-wrapping wet material and letting it dry into a hardened lock. He tore strips of tarp from the outer umbrella edges, soaked them in resin he had earlier collected, and bound the joints tightly. Once the acid dried the strips, they hardened like glue. The umbrella trembled under the new weight but held its shape better. The new skeleton allowed the canopy to flex with the wind rather than against it. More importantly, it allowed him to attach a handle extension, which he crafted from a broken relay pylon. Now the umbrella could be positioned hands-free, carried like a pack, or tilted for two-person coverage. He turned to Liry, who hadn't moved. Her back heaved slowly, and her eyes were unfocused again. "You won't survive another hour unless you move," he said. She blinked slowly. "Then leave me." "No," he said. "If you're conscious, you're useful. Stand." She tried, failed, then forced herself up onto one arm. Her legs dragged behind her uselessly, but her upper body responded enough to support her torso. He removed a length of power conduit from his belt and wrapped it under her shoulders and across his own chest, forming a crude harness. He didn't ask permission, he simply lifted her. She groaned in pain, but didn't resist. The new structure of the umbrella allowed him to walk upright while keeping her partially shielded under the angled canopy. The wind beat against the reinforced frame, but it flexed with each gust, the umbrella now acting as a living barrier rather than a static object. He moved downhill into a narrow ravine where runoff formed acidic streams glowing with volatile minerals. He stepped carefully, watching how the water behaved, where it gathered, where it disappeared. He noticed something unusual then, a series of small natural channels where the acid flowed but didn't pool. These grooves led toward a fissure in the rock wall, half concealed by overgrowth and bone-like formations. He adjusted course. Inside the fissure, the air changed. The sound of the storm muffled slightly, and the temperature dropped. It was a cave. Narrow at first, but it opened into a hollow chamber carved by years of weather. The ground was blackened from prior exposure to acid, but the central area remained untouched, shielded by a natural stone arch overhead. He lowered Liry against the wall and scanned the ceiling. There were signs of past cadets, charred remains of gear, pieces of armor melted into the floor, a broken boot embedded in rock. It wasn't safe, but it was safer than outside. He placed the umbrella across the entrance, angling it like a barricade. Then he started gathering stones. He built a loose ring around Liry, not as a defense but as a psychological barrier, something to mark the boundary of her safety. When he finished, he sat beside her. She stared at the ceiling. "How are you so calm?" he answered without emotion. "Because panic doesn't change the rain." She let that settle in. Outside, the wind shrieked louder. The storm was entering its peak cycle. Lightning crackled and the air lit up with green flashes that danced through the fissure like vengeful spirits. Lance reached into his pack and pulled out the copper wire he had scavenged earlier. Using the shards of the broken pylon, he began to craft a new tool, a directional funnel that would divert dripping acid runoff toward a side channel of the cave. He shaped the wire into a frame and stretched fragments of tarp across it, then propped it under a weak point in the ceiling. When the first drops fell, they slid along the tarp into the groove he had cleared with a metal shard. Liry watched, her breathing steadier now. "You're not just surviving," she said. "You're building something." "Survival isn't a pause," he replied. "It's action." As the funnel diverted the acid away, he sat back against the stone wall, not to rest, but to observe. He memorized the cave's shape, the way the light moved, how the air shifted when the wind outside changed direction. Every detail mattered. Virex 9 was not forgiving, and the next wave might bring something new, something worse. Liry drifted into a half-conscious state. Her body needed rest, but her mind was still alert. She mumbled once, something about the academy never preparing them for this kind of storm. Lance didn't respond. He knew the truth. The academy had never designed the test to be fair. It had been built to favor strength and biology over ingenuity, but that made it flawed. And flawed systems could be beaten. The storm continued, but within the cave a strange stillness had formed. Not safety, never safety, but a pause. A breath before the next choice. The umbrella stood at the entrance like a handmade guardian, patched and ugly but undeniably effective. It had bent, it had warped, but it had not broken. Lance sat in the dark, fingers still bloodied, eyes still scanning. He wasn't done yet, not until this planet bent to him the way he had bent its scraps to his will. Lance rose before the storm gave him reason to. His internal clock had warned him. He no longer trusted anything external. Not the rising glow of the acid-lit sky, not the whispering winds that seemed to echo from places they shouldn't, and certainly not the stillness that had settled inside the cave. Virex 9 did not rest. It only waited for arrogance. He wouldn't give it that satisfaction. Liry was asleep, though her sleep looked more like collapse. Her segmented arms curled in tight angles across her chest. Her breathing was shallow but even. He studied her for a moment before turning to the entrance, where the umbrella still stood, unmoved and gleaming with an acidic sheen. The patches he had applied the day before held up. The frame remained intact. Only the leading edge had begun to melt in one corner, forming a jagged hole no wider than his palm. He stepped toward the mouth of the cave and shifted the umbrella out of its wedge between two rocks. The wind had calmed for now, but the rain had thinned only slightly. He adjusted the curvature of the canopy, using a scrap of conduit to extend the rear stabilizer and change its angle. It was becoming more than a tool now, more than something to hide beneath. It was beginning to function like armor. As it evolved, so did his control over the environment. He glanced down into the ravine. Pools of iridescent acid dotted the terrain like sores. Debris floated inside the largest of them. Fragments of ruined equipment, the outer shell of a drone, what looked like the singed remains of an arm. He turned away from that and focused on what mattered. He needed higher ground. The rain distorted perception, but he could just make out the edges of a tower in the far distance. a twisted column of alien architecture partially collapsed but still standing. That was his next destination. A place with elevation meant information, and on a planet that refused to stop attacking, information was more valuable than rest. He returned to the cave and knelt beside Liry. Her eyes fluttered open at the sound of his footsteps. "You're leaving," she said, not as a question but an observation. He nodded. She tried to sit up but winced. "If you're going, I'll slow you down." "Yes," he said. Then, after a pause, "You'll stay, but stay smart." She gave him a look that hovered between gratitude and frustration, then dropped her head back against the stone. He handed her a length of tarp and a piece of scrap metal bent into a half-moon shape. "Reflect the runoff away from your legs, and if anything collapses, crawl under the ridge near the wall. The stone's thicker." She clutched the items with weak fingers. "You expect me to survive?" "No," he said. "I expect you to try." Then he turned and stepped into the storm again. The moment he crossed the threshold of the cave, his senses were struck by renewed violence. The acidity in the air clawed at his lungs like smoke, and the wind had shifted to an unpredictable swirling pattern. The umbrella held steady in his grip, but the wind pushed against it with erratic force. He adapted by leaning into the gusts, treating the wind like a living opponent, adjusting his stride with every step. He moved down the slope with calculated care, hopping over rivulets of acid, stepping across broken panels from long-dead machines. The landscape was worse than it had been before. He saw signs of failure everywhere. Gear discarded mid-sprint, trails of acid-burned footprints that ended abruptly, impact craters where someone had likely tried to dig down and found nothing but death. Everywhere he looked, he saw design, failed attempts at survival etched into the world like warnings. One cadet had built a cube from crystal shards and resin, but it had collapsed under the weight of the rain. Another had hollowed out the belly of a drone, but the acid had found a way inside. All of them had relied on form over function. Lance walked past each ruin with eyes that didn't linger. He needed no reminders. He already knew. As he approached the base of the tower, the terrain became trickier. The incline steepened and forced him to wedge the umbrella's spike into the ground for balance. He climbed in short bursts, stepping on ledges and pushing upward through the storm's relentless spray. At one point he slipped, caught his elbow on a sharp ridge, and bled. He tore a strip from the inner lining of his shirt and wrapped it without breaking stride. When he reached the structure, he realized it had once been a communications tower. Alien in design, with spiraled columns that curved like bone and wiring that pulsed faintly with residual energy. The acid had hollowed out much of its lower support, but the interior staircase remained mostly intact. He entered cautiously, holding the umbrella over his shoulder like a shield. As he stepped through the entry, a shape in the shadows shifted. Another cadet sat slumped in the corner, barely moving. A male Scinari, identifiable by his glowing throat sacs and scaled joints, was half-conscious, his head lolling against the wall. His skin had turned an unhealthy gray-green, and large swaths of it flaked away with every movement. He opened one eye and saw Lance, blinking slowly. "You're not supposed to be here," the cadet murmured. Lance said nothing. He looked around, noting how the upper levels of the tower still appeared structurally sound. A vertical shaft spiraled upward, broken in places but climbable. "Don't waste time," the cadet rasped. "Everything up there is just more death." "Good," Lance replied. "Then it's consistent." He moved past the Scinari, placing his feet carefully on each step. The climb was slick, and several times the wind threatened to pull him through the open frame, but the structure held. As he ascended, the world opened beneath him. Through gaps in the tower wall, he saw the field of cadets scattered like failed experiments, some unmoving, others curled beneath failed shelters. A few still wandered, dazed and likely lost. He finally reached the top. From this height, the entire testing zone became visible. The terrain rolled out like a battlefield, marked by the signature of acid and destruction. He pulled a pair of salvaged lenses from his pouch, fragments of drone optics he had wired together with copper bands, and scanned the landscape. He mapped runoff flows. He memorized locations of collapsed gear caches. He spotted mineral veins that had yet to be exposed. More importantly, he saw the extraction beacon, dormant now but built into the far end of the test zone, behind a ridge that had been hidden from ground level. That was where the survivors would be expected to reach after the storm. He folded the lenses and began the descent. By the time he reached the base of the tower again, the Scanari cadet had stopped breathing. Lance didn't stop to check, he already knew. The rain intensified again, but now he had a heading. He moved northeast, toward the hidden beacon ridge. Along the way, he stopped only to collect materials. He found a canister that had once held emergency gel. It was empty now, but made of a durable polymer. He tucked it under his arm. Next, he found a shredded cloak made of reflective threads, useless as clothing but perfect for lining the umbrella to bounce heat inward if the temperature dropped further. Hours passed without measure. His legs ached and his shoulders burned from the strain of holding the umbrella steady. But the new design distributed weight better than before. As he walked, he occasionally passed signs of life. Cadets curled into wet hollows, some blinking, some not. None of them moved when he did. Eventually, the ridge appeared. It rose from the horizon like a jawbone, jagged and white from centuries of corrosion. Beyond it, the beacon waited, but he didn't go there yet. He turned south, back toward the cave. He had made a choice. Lance didn't hurry on the way back. The storm still howled, the acid still fell, and the world remained merciless, but his footing was sure, his grip steady. The reinforced umbrella had become more than a tool. It was a structure, a symbol of action and defiance. Each step he took sent a clear message to the world around him. He would not just survive, he would impose order on chaos. The path he chose took him through new terrain, down jagged slopes and over debris fields that glowed faintly with mineral discharge. He noticed how the acid had changed the landscape since he first landed. Where before the rain merely melted, now it carved. Deep gullies formed channels through the land, redirecting runoff in unpredictable ways. He adjusted course constantly, watching how water moved, avoiding unstable ground where even his boots began to hiss and smoke. He reached the ravine again by dusk, guided more by intuition than sight. The cave entrance was partially obscured now, hidden behind a curtain of vapor. The cliffside had eroded further, and fresh stone had fallen around the perimeter. He approached cautiously, testing his steps, until he finally stood at the threshold. Liry was still alive. She lay inside the boundary stones he had built, her eyes half closed, but alert. Her lower limbs were wrapped in the reflective tarp, just as he had shown her. She had propped a section of conduit beneath a dip in the ceiling to redirect a leaking crack. The acid stains around her had dried in tight spirals. Evidence of movement, of calculation. She had not waited. She had worked. When she saw him, she blinked slowly. "You came back," he nodded. "The storm's shifting. There's a ridge. Extraction is behind it." She didn't speak for a long moment. When she did, her voice cracked. "I thought you'd leave. You had what you needed." "I did," he said. "And then I had more." She tried to sit up but groaned and fell back. "I can't walk." "You don't need to." He knelt beside her and pulled the polymer canister from his side. He had punctured it earlier to create two makeshift handles, reinforced with woven copper wire. He turned it sideways and propped it against her side, then began binding her torso to it with lengths of salvaged fiber rope. She let out a short breath. "You're turning it into a sled." "Not a good one," he said, "but good enough." When he finished the binding, he pulled her upright and slid the canister beneath her, dragging her weight backward until the majority of her frame rested against the slick plastic. He wrapped the final length of reflective tarp across her shoulders and anchored it at her waist. She looked up at him, her eyes wide and unguarded. "Why help me?" He didn't answer right away. He adjusted the umbrella's tilt, shifted the weight of the sled rope over his shoulder, and looked out into the rain-drenched valley. Then he said, "Because the test isn't about surviving. It's about proving you know why you should." He pulled. The sled resisted at first, scraping against loose stone and gathering streaks of acid that hissed down its sides. But the material held. Lance kept moving, body hunched forward, every muscle in his back and arms straining with each step. The umbrella above him bent and twisted, catching the wind like a living thing. He adjusted its tilt constantly, keeping the canopy angled to cover them both. Liry didn't speak again. She clutched the edges of the sled with both arms, her mouth clenched in silent pain. Her expression was raw, but there was no fear left in her eyes. Only resolve. The ridge loomed closer, but it wasn't just distance that challenged him now. The storm had changed. Lightning now danced across the sky in blinding arcs, hitting the ground and igniting pools of acid into bursts of fire. The air had grown hotter and gusts of steam poured from fissures like jets. The final phase of the storm had arrived. The worst part. His footing slipped once, and the sled dragged sideways into a shallow pit. He lunged to stop it before the acid at the bottom could reach her. His arm plunged into the pool, and pain tore through his nerves as the acid kissed flesh through a melted seam. He pulled back immediately, teeth clenched, but didn't scream. He pressed his burned arm against his side and dragged the sled back onto the main path with his good one. He didn't stop moving. Every step after that was a blur of pain and momentum. The wind howled louder, the rain fell harder, and the weight on his shoulder felt like it doubled with every meter. But he saw the beacon now, faint red lights blinking from beneath the ridge's lip. Just above it, hovering in the air, were the extraction drones. They were silent, scanning, recording. No interference, no rescue yet. He dragged the sled the last few meters up the ridge, feet sinking into slush, knees threatening to buckle. At the top, the wind nearly tore the umbrella from his hands. He turned it downward, shielding Liry's body, then knelt beside her and dropped to both knees, gasping. The drones reacted immediately. They descended without sound, their searchlights flashing green. One scanned Lance's face. Another hovered over Liry, emitting a soft hum. A third flew to the side and projected a translucent display into the air, detailing their biosigns, environmental readings, and timestamps. A female instructor appeared in holographic form, standing beside the drones in a flowing black uniform, her face unreadable. She looked over the two cadets in silence, her eyes flicking to the handmade umbrella still clutched in Lance's left hand. Its metal gleamed under the lights, pitted, stained, burned, but still standing. She spoke once. Test complete. A moment later, the drones engaged magnetic lifters and pulled both cadets into the air. The platform shimmered beneath them, forming a containment barrier to keep them from the still falling acid rain. Lance didn't resist. His muscles had gone slack. He stared upward into the flashing sky, the final drops of rain cascading down the side of the shield like tears. Hours passed in a blur. Medical scans, decontamination, rehydration, nutrient injections. When Lance finally came to, he was lying in a med bay aboard orbital station Kestrel. The lights were dim, the ceiling low. Liry lay in the pod beside him, eyes closed, bandaged, and breathing steadily. Her vitals were displayed on the screen above her bed. Stable. A male instructor entered the room, a high-ranking Zalari with green-tinted scales and a long, segmented spine. He approached slowly, datapad in hand. "You scored the highest survival index ever recorded on Virex 9, he said without emotion. "Your methods were deemed unorthodox, crude, inefficient." Lance said nothing. The instructor looked down at the pad. "But the panel has concluded that your improvisation, adaptability, and calculated risk-taking demonstrated an advanced understanding of environmental manipulation. You passed." He turned to leave but paused at the door. "And you saved someone. That wasn't part of the test." Lance finally spoke. "It should have been." The instructor said nothing more and exited. Later that day, Lance stood alone in the academy hall, dressed in clean gear, his hands still red with healing skin. The umbrella, his umbrella, had been placed on display in the survival exhibit, next to a short plaque. Crafted on Virex 9 during full-cycle storm. Materials, junk. Purpose, survival. Outcome, he stared at it for a long time. It didn't look like a weapon or a shield or even something intelligent, but it had done what nothing else had. It had endured. As he turned to leave, he noticed Liry entering the hall. She walked slowly, aided by a thin cane, but she stood tall. When she met his gaze, she smiled. He nodded once. "You made it." She nodded back. "You made sure I did." The two walked together out of the exhibit, side by side, neither saying anything more. No applause followed them, no music, no ceremony. But none of that mattered, because on a planet designed to destroy everything it touched, he had built something that held. And in doing so, he had proven what no alien design ever had. Ingenuity is humanity's oldest weapon, and it still works.